Right, good afternoon. I'll make a start. There's still a few people joining us, but welcome to this latest event for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on the environment. Today the issue is resource efficiency, waste, and the impact on the road to net zero. There's also been over recent decades quite a few attempts to reduce the amount of waste. This government's got various policies, some of it in the Environment Bill. What isn't often discussed is the impact of resource use and waste on meeting our net zero target by 2050, which is the subject today. Waste is about 6% of greenhouse gas emissions. And how can we get that down? And there has been quite a big reduction since 1990, I'm told over 60%. But we need to obviously get to net zero, need to get it further. And what are the challenges for that? And I'm delighted with our great panel. We've got Libby Peake, who's head of resource policy at the Green Alliance, Chris MacDonald, who's the chief executive of the Materials Processing Institute. Easy to recognise because he's the only one respectable enough to be wearing a tie in this hot weather. Well done, Chris. And then Sam Larson, Director of Programmes and Planning at Water UK, obviously representing the water industry, which deals with a lot of waste. And then Martin Bowman, who's the Senior Policy Manager at Feedback Global, which is one of the waste campaign groups. So without further ado, normal rules apply. I don't even need to say this because you're all doing it. Be on mute unless you want to ask questions. Please do. If you want to ask a question, please either put up your yellow hand icon, or indeed you can wave your hand, because I think I can see most people, or just say in the chat that you want to ask a question and I'll come to you. Speakers are going to just give their piece for 5 minutes or so each to start with, starting with Libby, who in fact, for your entertainment, has got an animated video to start with. I haven't seen this. I have no responsibility for its content. Say in advance, but over to you, Libby.
I guarantee it won't be controversial. I won't get you in trouble. But thanks very much for having me to speak here today. Yes, I'm Libby Peake. I'm head of resource policy at Green Alliance. And for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're a charity and think tank that focuses on achieving ambitious leadership for the environment. And I lead our work, our resource stewardship theme, which I think when a lot of people think about resources or resource policy, it quite often narrows quite quickly down to waste, and maybe extends a bit to recycling. It thinks about things about like plastic and whatnot. But what we mean when we're talking about resource stewardship is actually much wider, and it has a real impact both on climate and biodiversity. And I'm really glad to be joined today by people who are going to be able to speak about material impacts, water impacts, and food impacts, because these are all resources, all of the things that we require to run our economy that do have a really big impact. And so to set the scene, we've got a short video. It's Green Alliance's first ever animation, which my colleague Ollie is going to share from his screen to let you know why it's so important.
We all hate waste, but unnecessary waste is hardwired into our economic system. If the whole world consumed as many natural resources as we do in the UK, we'd need 3 Earths to supply them. According to the UN, extracting and processing resources is causing 90% of biodiversity loss and water stress around the world, and driving half of the world's carbon emissions. And the more resources we use, the more pollution we create. There are lots of reasons why our economy is so wasteful. Some things are actually made not to last at all. We can't easily repair the broken items we love and want to keep. Sometimes we buy things we don't really need. And some things made to last never get the chance. It doesn't have to be this way. There are plenty of solutions that can help to create a circular economy where products and the valuable materials they're made of are kept in use for as long as possible, meaning we don't have to keep making so much stuff. But the government strategy is still fixing single problems instead of the whole system. Unlike the plan to eliminate UK carbon emissions by 2050, there are no targets to cut resource use and help our economy change. We need bold targets and a plan to halve the UK's resource use by 2050.
Thanks, Ollie. So that sets out quite briefly our overarching desire to learn from the genuinely world-leading climate framework that the UK has developed for climate policy, and apply a similar sort of approach to resources, not least given the impact that could have on both the climate problem as well as the biodiversity problem. And what we want to see for that is, first of all, an overarching target to bring resource use in line with what the planet can reasonably sustain. And it's estimated that when it comes to renewable resources, the UK uses about 3 times as much as the world can renewably sustain. And when it comes to all resources, so including things like minerals and metals, we use twice as much. And so we do need to have an overarching goal to get that down, but that does also need to be complemented by plans for specific sectors and materials. It is going to be different depending on the sector you're going to be, the solutions that you're going to need to be implementing. And so it'll be great to hear from a few of those today about the solutions that they think should be brought on board. And we also do want to see as well binding interim targets, which is something that that has been really useful for keeping us on track for net zero and for showing us what needs to be done. And the government is actually developing some targets when it comes to resources through the Environment Bill, but they're not necessarily, at the moment, as they stand, they're going to be on resource efficiency, which compares resource use to GDP, and on waste minimization. But the amount of resources we use could still increase even if we do set those targets. So that's why we want to see an overall reduction target on consumption of resources. And just in terms of the title of this session and the impact that it could have, we've actually done some estimates along with the Centre for Industrial Energy Materials and Products, which was convened by the University of Leeds, and the carbon savings that you could have from resource efficiency. And so the stats that Anthony quoted at the beginning, that's actually for 6% of emissions. Those come from waste treatment. When it comes to resource use, actually it's responsible for a lot more. And globally, it's responsible for 50% of emissions. And in the UK, it is still responsible for a lot. And the CCC, for the first time in its 6 carbon budget, has actually started to quantify the savings that could be had from resource efficiency, particularly in the industrial sectors. And according to our estimates, actually, if we implement resource efficiency measures in just 5 key sectors, so construction, textiles, electronics, vehicles and food, we could get the country on track towards meeting its 4th carbon budget and actually nearly on track towards meeting the 5th carbon budget. The savings are actually bigger than what the government has achieved through the buildings regulations, which so far has been the biggest single thing that has driven carbon emissions down in the UK. So the size of the prize for recognising how important resources are and using them more wisely is actually really considerable when it comes to carbon. And I'm looking forward to getting stuck into this more with you all today.
Great, thank you for that introduction to topics. Can I just follow up with one quick question? Sorry, I meant to do questions afterwards, but just on, you made the case there for targets, as we have with the net zero. I know that the government in its 25-year environment plan did have targets, not legally binding ones, but targets for eliminating avoidable waste by 2050 and achieving a 65% recycling rate for household waste by 2035. Presumably you mean different targets or targets for the whole amount, or?
Yeah, so I mean, those targets, well, first of all, the avoidable waste, the government still hasn't come up with a definition of what avoidable waste means. So that target doesn't yet actually mean anything to me. But I think the main thing that we want to highlight is it's not just about focusing on waste and about recycling waste, but what will deliver the biggest
total resource use
is resource use. Yeah, and actually Wales has promised to develop such a target, to one planet resource target, and so it'd be great if the other nations followed suit.
Perhaps Wales is leading the way. And then comes Chris McDonald, the Chief Executive of the Materials Processing Institute. Chris, if you want to just start explaining what the Materials Processing Institute does.
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about that and a little bit about myself. And I support the comments Libby's made about reduction in the use of materials, but I'll also come on to talk a bit more about why I think recycling more materials is a big part of this as well, actually. But first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak this afternoon. And yes, the institute that I lead has been around for over 75 years as the UK's national centre for innovation in steel and metals. And our job is to commercialise technology for industry. We focus on industrial decarbonisation and the circular economy alongside digital technologies and advanced materials. And we're currently delivering a £22 million programme of innovation, which was announced by the Chancellor in the budget last year, which is funded by Innovate UK in exactly this area. But I'm also the chair of the UK Metals Council, which is one of the 14 sector councils that connects industry with government. Now, it's unsurprising then maybe that I want to focus on metals just for the next minute or two. And actually metals have almost a limitless capacity for recycling. Steel in particular has many properties that mean that recycling is often synonymous with upcycling. So we can transform scrap steel into increasingly high performance and advanced steel products. And recycling is intrinsically more environmentally friendly. So mining accounts for about 10% of world energy consumption. And obviously the more that we recycle, the less that we need to mine. But even leaving mining aside, for steel, switching from primary production to recycling leads to an immediate 85% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. But this makes sense not only from an environmental perspective, but for other reasons as well. So a second benefit of recycling is that the mining locations around the world are often where the industry itself is propping up undemocratic and exploitative regimes where workers are poorly treated, there is child labour and slave labour. And I think really for too long, Western consumers have been able to turn a blind eye to the consumption of materials produced overseas in ways that wouldn't be acceptable at home. So by taking a circular economy approach, we can help to drive up ethical standards and working conditions in supply chains. And there is another impact around these international supply chains as well that is an important consideration for our sovereign security. So increasingly we see geopolitical tensions and the security of materials are vitally important for national interest. And it's worrying when you see how many metals that are vital for our future are now listed as having a supply risk. And if anyone doubts our vulnerability, if you think about how quickly the blockage in the Suez Canal emptied international supply chains, we can see that a circular economy approach provides greater resilience for UK manufacturing and infrastructure too. And then an additional point around that really is that the circularity of metals is also vital for delivering the green industrial revolution. The green industrial revolution is a metals intensive revolution for electrification, energy generation and infrastructure. And there is a strong environmental case for metals to be favoured above other materials where possible to try and reduce carbon emissions as well. So as a consequence, again, whilst I support the comment from Libby about reducing the amount of materials that we use in an application, a consequence of the green industrial revolution will be a short-term increase in demand in materials and actually a greater shift towards metals. And my final point is that when we go green, this inevitably means going smart at the same time. So the UK economy as a whole has a problem with stagnating levels of productivity. But as we go green and invest in new production technology, we're also improving productivity and generating the fourth industrial revolution as well on the factory floor. So I think if we put all of these things together, we can see that with supply chain security, sustainability and ethics and increasing productivity to achieve a green industrial revolution, there is a big opportunity for the circular economy that's of direct benefit to the UK. And in fact, the UK is almost uniquely placed to benefit from this approach, having been at times the most industrialised nation on earth and retained a strong manufacturing economy. We do have an abundance of raw material within our economy and an industrial base that's capable of utilising it. So thank you, and I'll be happy to join the discussion later.
Thank you very much. And as you say, there are many different arguments for pursuing better resource efficiency. Can I just ask before you move to Sam, Libby had mentioned their key proposal was for a target for the amount of resources used. Would you support a national target in the same way?
I think it's difficult actually for the point that I made about the increasing demand. So I think what it would be good to do is look at that on an application basis. So rather than saying let's reduce the demand in the economy, look at the applications and have targets for reducing on an application basis. There's been very good track record in the automotive sector, for instance, around lightweighting, taking material out of cars. So if we did it on an application by application basis, then yes, but given that over the coming years we're going to be investing an awful lot in offshore wind or new nuclear or whatever, actually our material demand is going to increase in the short term.
I'll let Libby come back to that later. We'll come back to it. Now moving to Sam Larson from Water UK.
Thanks.
What's the water industry view on this?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the invite to speak and for the 4 questions, which I'll probably use as a bit of a guide to go through this to make sure I cover all the main points. Obviously, this is a subject very close to our hearts. The water industry has an obvious role, I guess, in the circular economy, in that we don't make water, we recycle it using thousands of water recycling plants across the UK. And companies have always been very active in the recycling industries for decades. So using those 4 questions as a quick guide, talk quickly about the policy priorities. I think from our perspective, the main priority has to be the same as the other 2 speakers, which is we have to make the best possible use of the resources and materials we already have here in the UK, and to make that very much more circular. It's worth dwelling on how we might do that in the water industry in particular. So 3 quick examples. It's worth recognizing first that the water industry is actually currently quite chemical intensive. The chemical intensity of the industry, chemical consumption, that is, can be measured in the order of hundreds of thousands of tons a year. That's quite a lot of chemical. That's mainly imported. Just for scale, if one put that onto lorries, 100,000 tons, that would be a line of lorries stretching for 50 kilometers, and it's hundreds of thousands of tons, so it's multiples of that. It's a very significant chemical consumer. Reusing wastes is something the industry is very passionate about. We've been reusing waste such as sewage sludges for years. I expect many people already know about that. But we see in future greater reliance on using nature to solve those treatment demands, moving away from that import of chemicals, moving towards more natural solutions that can achieve those treatment goals without relying on chemical import. So turning to net zero, and I had the great pleasure of leading the industry's work on net zero over the last couple of years, and we published a net zero route map last year, and water companies in the UK have all committed to reach net zero well ahead of the government's 2050 target. Slightly different scopes in different geographical regions, but targets of 2030 or 2040 across the UK. And the work that we did centrally on the net zero route map that's on our website draws out 4 main things. The first thing is there's a big energy transition. The water industry uses about 2% of UK's electricity. That's a very, very significant energy consumer in the UK. And part of getting to net zero for us involves creation of more renewables, so generating more of our own renewables, but making better use of that biomethane production that I mentioned earlier. So that is taking those sewage sludges, those sewage wastes, those unavoidable wastes that come from the UK population, and converting that into a useful, in fact, probably precious gas, which can be injected into the gas grid to help us decarbonise, but also to help others in the UK economy to decarbonise. Now, in the route map, water efficiency also plays a massive role. The reduction, of course, of the amount of water we need to treat and provide flows through into reduced chemical consumption, reduced energy consumption. There's also an important strand of work to be done on process emissions, and this is something that sits directly within DEFRA's waste emissions inventory mentioned at the outset. That 5% of UK emissions includes emissions from wastewater treatment works. Those are the sort of emissions that naturally come from the biochemical breakdown of sewage. And that's an area that requires great research, innovation and research over the next decade. A strand which is referred to quite comprehensively in the 6th carbon budget, as it happens. And finally, the 4th part of our net zero journey, very important, is the shift towards nature-based solutions. And that is tackling those treatment demands in new ways, moving away from using concrete and steel type assets, building ever more concrete and steel assets to tackle even more treatment demands, moving away and using natural solutions such as reed beds, tree planting, peatland restoration, and so on, to remove the need to do that treatment in the first place. The 3rd question was about collaboration, and this is an area where we can see will help with pace of the transition to net zero. mainly because many of the sort of interventions or measures that are needed in society already exist. They just need to upscale and they need to be broadened out across sectors to join up the work that's already being done at pilot scale across several sectors. So a few very quick examples of some cross-sector points that overlap with the water industry. First one is industrial water efficiency. Most people, when they think water efficiency, think of in the home, and of course that's hugely important and can be influenced. And there's a lot about that in our route map. Equally important is water efficiency in industry. And quite interestingly, as climate change takes effect in the UK, we're starting to see new consultant product offerings coming forward, new consultants offering services to industry to help make individual industries or individual sites 100% water reusers. And some really interesting success stories from around the world, interesting work we've done in Denmark and Holland and in the UK to help industry get to a stage where it reuses all of its water. Obviously with important benefits for society as a whole, particularly in drier periods. Important overlaps with food. Obviously, food produces a waste, think curbside collection, but also think the waste that come from the manufacture of food and retail of food. And it's very similar in kind of nature to the raw material that we use to make biogas already in the industry. And we think there's a great opportunity to actually draw two waste streams together. That is the waste stream that comes from sewage treatment and the waste stream that comes from food waste, draw those together onto the same sites and create even more of that low carbon gas, so we can inject even more of that gas into the gas grid to help others decarbonise, particularly in advance of hydrogen being ready across the economy to do the majority of the work after 2040. But currently some barriers in the area of drawing those two separate waste streams together on the same site, mainly because they're separately regulated, and a great opportunity there to simplify the regulation around what we call co-digestion. That is the digestion of food and sewage sludges on the same site. And last one for cross-sector collaboration is the energy story. I mentioned earlier that a big part of our transition to net zero is on the energy side. We are big energy consumers. We are also big energy producers. We host solar, we have wind turbines, and we also create that biomethane that I mentioned earlier. But really we see that those products that we create, particularly biogas, which is a really quite precious commodity, it's a transportable, dispatchable gas, very useful for industry until hydrogen is ready, needs to be put to better use. And at the moment, it's quite often used in societal terms, quite a low value way, which is to put it through engines to create electricity. And for various reasons, that is probably not the best use for that precious gas, certainly within 5 or 10 years' time. And policies to help move that biogas production into greater injection in the grid is probably the best long-term use for the gas. And then finally, question around support. I think there's a number of really useful things here. Some of the previous speakers have already mentioned. I think the 6th carbon budget is really important. It's going to become even more important as time goes on. I think it's a really fascinating story when you get to sectors. Clearly, there's a very early trend in all of the 6 carbon measures around resource efficiency. And really the first 10 years worth of benefit in the 6th carbon budget mainly comes from resource efficiency, certainly in things like concrete, cement, steel, those sorts of things. Secondly, I think Libby's video was absolutely fascinating. I can see a role for something like that, or maybe even bigger than that for various reasons, particularly on net zero. I think most people that engage with the climate science get it very quickly once they engage with it. And I think greater engagement with consumers, the public, broader public, on what needs to be done, the quicker everyone will be on board. So maybe some sort of national campaign might be really useful. But maybe for government more specifically, 2 final things. One, really understanding how end-to-end systems work. making sure that the analysis that's done to make decisions about single sectors or cross-sector ideas really do find the best way, the best overall benefit, the best net benefit, not falling into any kind of obvious traps, but trying to make sure that we find the best benefit, the best, most cost-efficient solution for society overall, and the best carbon benefit for society overall. So better model analysis and modelling. And finally, making sure that emerging government policies in a whole range of areas are genuinely aligned to the overarching climate goals, the overarching environmental ambitions. In the case of the water industry, I think an important opportunity right now with a thing called WINEP reform, that is the Water Industry National Environment Programme, which is a £5 billion programme every 5 years, where we change our asset base. And every 5 years, we have an asset transformation programme. Now, aligning that with net zero, aligning that with a circular economy seems like an obvious step to take in the near future to really put some of this on the right path.
Okay, thank you very much, Sam, for that very full introduction. And now we're coming to our last speaker, last but not least, Martin Bowman from Feedback Global. If you could, Martin, if you could just explain what Feedback Global is first as well.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting us today, and thanks so much to the other speakers. So I'm Martin Bowman. I'm Senior Policy and Campaigns Manager at Feedback Global. We're an environmental campaigning organisation that sort of focuses on sustainable food, but has a particular focus on food waste, which I'll be talking about today. And I'm going to share some slides, if I may. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
Fantastic. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about two main policies that Feedback thinks could help the UK reduce food waste. And for a bit of context, Feedback have about a decade's worth of experience writing reports and writing policy in food waste. And here are a selection of our reports over the years. So I'll just kick off by contextualizing this. So about 50% of the UK's food waste occurs in businesses, and this isn't often understood. I think often there's a pervasive myth that the vast majority of the UK's food waste occurs with the consumer, but these stats often overlook the vast volumes of food waste that occur on farms, which are currently excluded from the data due to lack of statistics. Actually, once you factor that in, it's about a 50-50 split, but the general point is we don't know exactly how much food is wasted on farms still, and that's a huge gap that needs to be filled. Another contextual point is how important it is to prioritising preventing food waste from arising in the first place over recycling. So you'll see here the results of a life cycle assessment that Feedback conducted with Bangor University, and we compared different destinations for food waste. And we've heard a little bit about anaerobic digestion, which is of course better than landfill or incineration. But actually, when you look at how that compares with alternatives like sending food waste to animal feed, but particularly with prevention, and even more when you prevent food waste and then plant trees on the land that's spared, where the savings are actually about between 9 and 40 times greater per tonne of food waste for prevention than sending it to anaerobic digestion. So I'm going to focus on two policies that will speed up the UK's food waste prevention. And the first is mandatory food waste reporting. So a bit of background here. We've had a decade now of campaigners calling for food businesses to publish their food waste data, but we've just been banging our heads against the brick wall for a decade. We've really seen very little progress. It's been over a decade since the first voluntary commitment was launched in the UK. Tesco reported their food waste data for the first time 8 years ago. But since then, many high-profile campaigns led by groups, including Feedback, but also Hugh Fearnley-Whittlestall on primetime TV, a petition with over 250,000 signatures have called on businesses to publish their food waste. And despite this, today we still only have 60 businesses in the UK reporting their food waste publicly. We have a lot more who are reporting food waste in secret to RAP, and then even more who just aren't measuring or reporting at all. And if we're carry on the current track, we won't see the 250 largest food businesses report their food waste until 2026, and that isn't guaranteed, as there's no enforcement mechanism for that. So in response to this, a number of people have called for mandatory food waste reporting, including the EFRA committee several years ago found that a voluntary approach is inadequate. We recommend that the incoming government requires food businesses over a particular size to publicly report data. Now, this was about 3 to 4 years ago that this inquiry continued. More recently, Tesco took the unprecedented move of calling for mandatory food waste reporting, saying that quite in broad terms that the government will miss Sustainable Development Goal 12.3 to halve food waste if we do not implement this, and calling on the government to do this as soon as possible. More recently, RAP have been talking about how it's not a question of if, it's a question of when this is introduced. Now, the government is we were promised a consultation on this in 2019. There's been so far 2 years delay, and we still don't know the date that consultation will be delivered. An excellent thing that would be really helpful for those present to help with is to build pressure for that consultation to finally be delivered. We understand hopefully it will come this summer. Now, the concerning thing about the timeline that we've seen so far is simply that it is far too slow. The concrete proposals that we've seen is for companies not to report their food waste data to 2024. So this is another 3-year wait for action. And this is simply unnecessary, as a lot of these companies already have this data. They're just sitting on it. So we call for an alternative timeline where companies who already have the data will publish this publicly next year at the latest, and all other companies will report their food waste publicly by 2023. A second kind of complement to this is food waste targets. Now, to contextualize this, we have got voluntary targets currently for the reduction of food waste in supply chains, but they've so far yielded very little in results and been very slow. They're far better than nothing, but they've yielded very slow results. So if you take the UK's retail, manufacturing, catering sectors in combination, in 7 years of voluntary agreements, that their food waste has been reduced from about 3.1 to about 2.9 million tonnes of food waste, and that's about 1% reductions a year. I think we can agree that we can probably go faster than that. The future targets currently under voluntary commitments are to slightly increase that to 1.5% a year. It's also really important to remember that this is just for retail, manufacturing and catering. So the estimates of how much food is wasted in the primary production sector are actually that as much food may be wasted in that sector as all of the other business sectors combined, potentially around 3.6 million tonnes. And currently, this is just completely excluded from the UK's voluntary commitments. There's no baseline for how much food waste exists in that sector and no concrete national targets to reduce it. So if you take all business food waste overall, roughly the current progress is about 0.5 to 1% a year reduction. It's really very slow. Now, we saw a very encouraging signs in the waste and resources strategy in 2018 that the government was intending to consult on introducing mandatory food waste reduction targets for businesses and legal powers for extended producer responsibility obligations. Now, unfortunately, this has sort of seems to have dropped off the government radar. And so one of the things we're really pushing for is for this to come back, because they could potentially yield huge emission savings. So we did a life cycle assessment that calculated the potential emission savings of halving the UK's food waste and then planting trees on the land that would be spared by this. And we found that this would reduce the UK's total emissions by 11% and create enough farmland to feed 28% of the population. Now, sorry, I should clarify that this is emissions savings overseas as well. So if you break that down, that could result in 18.4 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent savings domestically, and far more than that overseas in sort of import emission savings. So this is a huge potential emissions reduction. Now the problem is, as I say, that this would require about 6 million tonnes of the UK's total about 12 million tonnes of food waste to be reduced, whereas currently under voluntary commitments we're only planning on reducing this by 2.5 million tonnes.
Can I encourage you to speed up, because we've got to have time for questions at the end.
Of course, yeah, no problem. Sorry, this is, I think, my second to last slide. So the proposed timeline currently for the consultation on this, we've heard, is not going to be until 2026 or 27. This is nearly 10 years since the consultation was promised in 2018, and only 3 years before the Sustainable Development Goal deadline. So we think that this should be, this consultation should be delivered this year, as we already have a decade of evidence of voluntary commitments not working. Finally, just as a last point, of course, some food waste is caused across the supply chain by retailers pushing food waste onto their suppliers. And so we believe that the government should review its decision not to extend the grocery code adjudicators' remit to cover indirect suppliers like farmers, to protect producers against this. So thank you very much. I hope that was helpful, and look forward to questions.
Well, thank you, and thank you for those very practical suggestions as well about food waste. I'm opening it up to questions. If you do want to ask a question, put up your yellow hand, or indeed just wave your hand with your camera on, or mention it in chat. I'm going to come back first. Well, you come up with questions. Come back to Libby first, the Green Alliance, just on the issue of the overall resources target, which you suggested, which because Chris at the Materials Processing Institute wasn't supportive of an overall target, but thought you could have sector-specific targets. And it would be quite difficult, wouldn't it be quite difficult to define what you mean by resources as well, to include in that target? How would it work?
So yeah, I've got 3 points. Like a good politician, I've got 3 points to make on that, and hopefully I'll win over Chris and other people on the call to support this target. First of all, we are proposing an overarching target based on UN evidence that the average sustainable amount of total resource use you could have per head of population is between 6 and 8 tons per person, and in the UK we use about 14, so we're using about twice as much as what's considered sustainable. But the idea behind this target is that it's a long-term target. So if indeed it is determined that there might be a slight increase in some material use or something along the way, that could be accounted for in the interim targets and in the roadmaps that we're calling for. And second of all, we are actually, in line with what Chris suggested, we are actually saying that an overarching target on its own, which is just for all material use, wouldn't necessarily drive all of the right sorts of improvements that you want to make, because you might just target one material where you could have one really big win and not loads of other materials where actually it's much more crucial that we reduce their use and that we use them better. So for things like critical raw materials, and there's various lists of critical raw materials that float around, but there's roughly about 30 of them that are considered vital to the functioning of the economy and that carry some supply chain risks. For those in particular, we definitely want some specific targets and specific roadmaps to figure out how best to use them. And then I suppose the final point that I'll make, before I'm convinced that we actually do need a massive increase in a lot of these metals and materials, I think we do need to think more carefully about what we can do to address the neglected side of the energy equation. So most of what government has done so far in terms of meeting net zero and addressing carbon emissions has focused on supply side measures. So improving the sorts of technologies that we use and the cleanliness of the technologies that we use to power our economy to reduce carbon that way. But that's only half of the equation, because the other side of the equation is demand. And there are lots of neglected areas in demand that could reduce the need to create energy and use energy in the first place. So thinking about new sorts of business models, including circular economy business models where people don't necessarily own products, but perhaps they reuse them or rent them. Things like that could actually reduce considerably the amount of energy that we need to use in the first place. So I'd say before we rush into definitely saying that we're going to need to increase materials a substantial degree, even in the short term, I think we need to have a clear think about where we want to get to, where we can get to in the long run in terms of both material use and the energy needed to provide a happy and healthy economy for everyone who lives in the country. And it might not be as big an increase as it would if we just focus, well, it wouldn't be as big an increase if we were just focusing on supply rather than thinking about new ways of doing things.
Presumably, just a quick follow-up question. I know I've got a question about food waste from Joe. If the primary objective of targeting reduction in resources to reach net zero on greenhouse gas emissions, I realise there are probably other objectives such as reducing landfill and so on. But you need to target the reduction on those resources which are particularly energy intensive, because there'll be some that are obviously a lot less energy intensive, but some like wood, where you could argue, for example, that it actually absorbs carbon dioxide. Wouldn't it be more effective if you target particular areas?
So we would definitely want to evaluate it based on particular types of both sectors of the economy, but as well as the different sorts of resources that are used, and have differing goals depending on what material you're talking about. And one of the resources that would come into that is food waste. And I think Martin's made a really compelling case, not food waste on food, on how we can actually do a lot in that area, which would then free up land, as well as improving biodiversity outcomes and delivering massive carbon benefits. So a lot of these things they would have carbon benefits, but in a lot of instances they'd have even bigger savings, even bigger benefits in terms of water savings potentially, as well as biodiversity gain. So I think there's compelling cases to be made across the board for why we should be doing this.
Okay, thank you. Now we've got a question from Joe Tetlow about food waste.
Hi there. Thank you to all the speakers. Really interesting talks there. My specific question is to Martin about food waste, and it's just to ask whether there's any international examples of best practice, and where does the UK sit internationally in terms of what we're doing on food waste, and are there other countries perhaps in Europe or across the world which are doing better than us, that we can learn the lessons from them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's different aspects of food waste that are being done well by different countries. I mean, actually, the really exciting opportunity with the mandatory food waste reporting is this would be a world first. And I mentioned in particular about the lack of on-farm data. That is a global black hole. There is not a single country in the world that has an accurate baseline for how much food is wasted on farms, and it's a huge problem. There'll be sort of reports coming out about this soon, I believe, and it's so if the UK implemented this mandatory food waste reporting and used that to develop a baseline for how much food is wasted on farms, that would make the UK a world leader and would be an excellent thing, in fact, to champion at COP. There are examples of food waste regulation around the world, but not so much on targets. We've seen some regulation, for instance, obliging countries to redistribute food. But we find this problematic, as I think the priority should be sort of designing food waste out of the system in the first place and sort of providing strong financial welfare support. Just a last point actually is on the AD question. There's some excellent legislation, which again I think would be fairly world leading from the UK, of mandatory separate food waste collections, which is going to be launched soon, which is a fantastic initiative. The flip side of that is we worry that lots of AD plants may be built for this, diverting food waste from landfill, but then ironically lower the waste disposal costs, which may disincentivize prevention. So one of our proposals is that AD plants have a mandatory floor minimum price, the gate fee that they charge for food waste collection, and that can be used as a policy tool to incentivize food waste prevention by raising waste disposal costs.
Okay, great, thank you. I think Bob Harris, I saw you waving your hand. I don't know if you.
Sorry, can I come in quite quickly and provide?
Okay, Libby, you come in quickly, then we'll come to Bob Harris.
I completely endorse everything Martin said about the need to have mandatory food waste collection. I think it's outrageous that a decade and a half to voluntary commitments, we still don't know how much food is wasted throughout the economy. But also in terms of the consumer side, the household side, which is where most of the data exists and most attention has focused, the UK is particularly bad in terms of the food waste that it creates. We create probably more food waste per person than anywhere else in Europe, and countries like Eastern European countries do tend to waste a lot of food, and a lot of that's probably waste a lot less food, about 5 times less than we waste here from the household perspective, and a lot of that probably is cultural. And so it's quite difficult to target, but changing the relationship with food, the sort of enthrallment with on-the-go consumption and convenience could certainly help improve our relationship with food and make sure that we're not wasting as much from the household, as well as having things like that universal food waste collection that Martin mentioned as well.
Okay, thank you, Libby. All good points well made. So Bob Harris, I think you had a question.
It's for Samuel. If you were to change from sand filtration to granite dust filtration, you could use that granite dust on soils to absorb atmospheric carbon, and you could mineralize the soils at the same time. Now, I don't know whether you've considered that, but it sounds to me that you're using a lot of sand, and you could be using a lot of granite dust, and you could be doing a lot of mineralization, and you could be doing a lot of removal of that atmospheric carbon if you wanted to. Does that interest you?
I think it could do, yes, absolutely. It's not something that's been included in the route map. We do in the route map look quite heavily at ways of avoiding treatment altogether. I think as many as the other speakers have said, taking the overarching load off of systems has a multiplier effect on the benefits. There are a number of smaller order things that can be done around switching technology, switching materials, those sorts of things, but they have so far proved to be lower order compared to the sort of overall resource efficiency points. But I'm happy for you to write to me if that's helpful. If you've got some details, or put me in contact with somebody with some details, that'd be really helpful.
Pleased to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I've got a question that has come through about what lessons can be drawn from international efforts to prioritise greater resource efficiency for environment and climate. So are there particular practices in other countries around the world that you think we really ought to adopt in the UK? And I'm going to take you in order. I'll pick on Martin first, and then Chris and Sam and Libby. What would you really like to see followed from other countries?
Well, there are some, so the EU is actually introducing an unfair trading practices directive soon. So I think it would be excellent for the UK to follow suit with that and extend our legislation to cover indirect suppliers like farmers.
Unfair trading practice.
Unfair trading practice, yeah, so sorry.
So
there,
how does that cover waste and resource use?
Yeah, so sure, actually, yes. So I should have made that more explicit before. Basically, there is an overlap here because often the risks and costs of food waste are pushed by powerful supply chain actors like retailers onto their suppliers and also their customers, actually. So this occurs through means such as last-minute order cancellations, changing cosmetic specifications at the last minute, so sort of rejecting things for being too wonky or the wrong size, but actually they would have been accepted the week before. And by regulating these practices, we can give farmers protection from these kind of practices and make sure that they waste less and their incomes are boosted.
Okay, Chris, what would you like to see? What are the particular things from other countries you think would be ideal for us to follow? We've got a question from Malcolm Caithness, which we'll come to in a minute.
Okay, well, actually, the thrust of what I was saying was that the UK really has a unique opportunity to develop a competitive advantage around this. So this is very much for me about the UK leading. So because we have this kind of embedded infrastructure that we're turning over constantly, and we're one of the world's biggest exporters of scrap metal. Actually, the thing that we can do better than anybody else is to develop the means to utilize that. Whereas, and that reduces our dependency on other countries. So other countries, quite rightly pursue resource strategies based on their inherent resources. And my suggestion is that we would do the same in the UK. This helps us to green our economy and also gives us a competitive advantage as well.
Okay, great. Sam, all the international lessons.
Yeah, thank you. I'll give you three very quickly. I think the first one is finding a way to get the fantastic work that's been done in Denmark on reducing those process emissions I mentioned earlier, getting those fully deployed in the UK. It's something that's actually mentioned in the SIC carbon budget. So there's actually a sort of a strand in the budget to make that happen, but no policy in place yet to sort of link that through into the industry. So I think there's something there. Chemical strategy. Lots of European countries, particularly the Scandinavians, have done quite a bit on the control of pollution in source products, effectively taking some of the chemicals out of the product so that their water industries don't have to then invest carbon, energy, and chemicals in taking them out of the water further on down the line. So a comprehensive chemical strategy in the UK would really help take some of that treatment load off the industry, help cut that carbon. And then finally, nature-based solutions. We're seeing throughout the world creative ways of treating water without relying on building ever more concrete and steel infrastructure, chemical and energy intensive processes. So really embedding those nature-based solutions examples here in the UK, I think would be really helpful.
Libby, very quickly, and before we come to Malcolm, any particular things you think we should learn from other countries?
Yeah, I'll quickly go through three as well. The first is from Germany, a program that they've got called Progress, which is their resource efficiency program, which is really focused on improving manufacturing processes, keeping manufacturing processes in Germany, but also reducing the impacts of those. And they have sector-specific groups and sector-specific advice to make sure that all of the different industries are using as few resources as possible in their production process. And that's been quite a successful scheme there. And then I'll also point to France, who are leading the way when it comes to providing people with longer lasting repairable products. And they're just developing a repairability index, which is going to be on all televisions and various other things, including also lawnmowers. It's quite an interesting list at the point of sale to tell people how repairable the products are, whether or not spare parts are going to be available, and for how long, and the cost of those spare parts. And we know that all of these sorts of things are important to keeping certainly consumer goods in use for as long as possible, which means that you don't have to keep making as many. And then the final international examples I'll give is the city of Amsterdam, because I think we do obviously need central government to do a lot more on this agenda, but cities actually are potentially very, very powerful in this area as well. And so just in the last year, the city of Amsterdam has launched a circular economy program based on Kate Raworth's donut economics theory, promising to be a 100% circular city by 2050, I believe. And I think they're still working out what those definitions are and what they mean, but they're going to be focusing on key areas like food, consumer goods, and the built environment, which are all things that we've highlighted today as being really important. And so I think that'll be at least an interesting one to watch to see what they achieve and how they achieve it.
Okay, all very interesting suggestions there. Now, Malcolm, Lord Caithness, you had a question. One of the vice chairs of the APPG.
Thanks, Anthony. A quick question for all the panel, please. What is the one thing you would like to change in the Environment Bill to improve the situation with regard to waste? Because we're about to start committee on Monday, but you're only allowed one thing.
This is your chance to put forward amendments directly to somebody on the committee. So should we do Sam, Martin, Chris, and then Libby?
Thanks. I was hoping you were going to come to me last, give me a little bit more time to prepare for that question, because I think it is a really great opportunity, actually. Thank you. What would we do? I think what we would be calling for is something quite high level. across all of the targets that water can contribute to, really some way of helping find what is sort of being referred to across the sector as the fixer. So the role in each sort of sub-region, each catchment, as it were, to work out how on earth we move towards nature-based solutions in a big way across the industry. Those are obviously going to be very site-specific. As you can imagine, the concrete and steel solution, you could plonk it anywhere in the UK and it would work more or less in the same way. Nature doesn't work like that, and natural schemes need to be designed in situ to suit the landscape, to suit the land availability. So a really clever eye on how to enable that transformation, I think, would be mine.
Okay, Martin, what amendment would you want for the Environment Bill to reduce waste? I think
a big question.
I think, well, isn't it? You probably used one of the ones who said mandatory reporting on food waste, presumably.
Yeah, so I believe that the government already will have power for that. One thing that's great, that I believe is currently in the Environment Bill, is seeking powers for the extended producer responsibility schemes and to set targets. So making sure that those powers are achieved would be an excellent thing to defend. Yeah, but the key thing, as I say, I think the government already has the power to introduce mandatory reporting and targets, but we just need to make sure that they deliver on that soon. And that's our priority at the moment. I guess an interesting point was I haven't looked into the detail of this, so this is something I'd be happy to work on you with, is whether the government would currently have the legal power to set a floor price on gate fees that AD plants could charge. So I'm not actually sure about that, but be really happy to keep in touch with you over the coming week to see.
So I don't know the answer to that, but it'd be very easy to ask government whether it thinks it has those powers. So we can follow that off bilaterally. Chris, if there was one amendment in the Environment Bill you wanted to reduce waste, you've got Lord Caithness interested to know what it is.
Yeah, well, there is one thing I can mention. So one thing that my organisation looks at is industrial symbiosis, so how we can take waste from one industrial process and turn it into a valuable product in another process, or in fact combine two waste streams to create something of value. And this generally is a waste reduction initiative. One of the big barriers to innovation there is around the classification of products as waste. So that can just become at that point just too difficult for companies to engage. So having maybe a more pragmatic approach about the difference between something that is originally classified as a waste product becoming a byproduct would promote innovation in the sector. Okay,
great, thank you. And then Libby, finally, what if you could have one amendment in the Environment Bill to reduce waste, what would it be?
I'm going to be cheeky and say, take it as read that my number one priority is that we actually institute a resource use reduction target through the Environment Bill process. But actually, it'd be remiss of me not to mention the priority amendment in this area for the Greener UK and Link coalitions, which we're a part of. And it's actually quite a simple one, and it seems quite minor, but it would send a really strong signal. So it's on Schedule 9, the power to impose charges on single-use plastic items, which we say should actually be expanded to cover all single-use items, because at the moment the government is really limiting itself and sending a signal that it doesn't want to end throwaway culture in general. It only wants to do it when it comes to plastic, and that power doesn't have to be so limited. And we already know that lots of companies are just switching away from single-use plastic to equally unnecessary items made from other sorts of single-use materials. And so a really simple tweak to that schedule could future-proof the legislation and send a much stronger signal that the government wants to end throwaway culture more generally. And then hopefully it could run on from there.
Great, thank you very much. It is 5 o'clock. We've run out of time. Thank you for those suggestions, and thank you to our panelists, Libby, Sam, Martin and Chris, and thank you everyone else for this fascinating discussion on resource use and reaching net zero. There's clearly a lot of work to do in this area. We've had a lot of very concrete and sensible suggestions, and hopefully we'll be able to follow that up. Thank you all, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.